Welcome to another episode of Laugh at Brad. Today we will be opening a box. A box clothed in dead tree pulp and colored with inks made from chemicals that are ruining our world. The tape here is causing global warming because it is made out of petroleum films. The cardboard, made from the husks of dead baby rats, is actually biodegradable. And today we will open the secret envelope. It says, business number, whatever, Bookcraft, 1990. The dream job was offered to Brad to buy a book publishing company and do the most creative things and rub shoulders with apostles and church historians as well as artists and musicians. This was a job Brad could see himself doing for many years, and then, what happened to make you leave this job? What was your favorite part of this work? How did this business influence your mind and heart? And what are the best memories of this time period? Okay. Here we go. So, as you recall, in our last episode, Brad was hanging over a cliff, ready to throw himself into the gulf of misery and endless woe because he was not actually enjoying his time working on Ancestry and Western Standard Publishing. And then one day, out of the blue, I got a phone call from Russell Orton. Russell was the son of the founder of Bookcraft. His father had been the editor of what was called the Improvement Era, which was the predecessor to the Ensign, a magazine of the church. And his father was asked by then Prophet Heber J. Grant to consider leaving the employ of the church and starting a book publishing company. And he said that if he did, President Grant would be his first author. So he did. He left the employee of the church, started a book publishing company, and it became known as Bookcraft, and had been the traditional alternative to Deseret Book, which was owned by the church itself. And there was a desire on the part of the brethren leading the church that there be an alternative publishing company to which they could publish works without it being under the direct imprimatur of the church. So over the years, Bookcraft published every living prophet from Heber J. Grant until Gordon B. Hinckley, which was the period in which I ran Bookcraft. He was the first prophet not to join our author ranks. Instead, he returned to Deseret Book. Anyway, back to my story. So, Mr. Orton called me, said, would you like to buy Bookcraft? And immediately I had a very clear impression. I remember the moment it happened that this was going to happen, that this was part of the purpose for us moving back to Utah. However, I needed a lot of money that I did not have myself. And so I reached out to Alan Ashton, who is one of our investors at Western Standard Publishing, aka Ancestry.com, and asked him if he would be interested in being our financial backer, and also invited him to be an active participant in the company. He indicated that he loved books. His wife told me a story about him being caught at a stoplight, people honking at him as he was driving because he had a book open in his lap and was reading and had forgotten to pay attention to the light.
That's not safe.
I know it's not safe. Don't do that. So Alan called Elder Packer, then president of the Quorum of the 12, and asked his opinion. Basically, would it be a good thing for Bookcraft to be owned by Alan Ashton? And Elder Packer said it would be a good thing. So with that sort of tip of the hat, Alan called me back and said, I'm ready to do it. And so I negotiated the transaction with the Orton family. Not terribly easy. Since it was a family-owned business and Mr. Orton had no children himself and didn't have anyone to pass the business on to, He had only recently become the manager of the business. He had not been active in the church for many years of his life, and so the family had outsiders, people outside the family who had run the business. But he had recently married a woman who was a writer for the Deseret News and had reactivated in the church and had come to run the company in its most recent years. Still was kind of a stern old man. And so there were difficult moments in the process, but we finally closed the transaction. And the delicate dance around buying Bookcraft was that Infobases, which was one of the businesses we owned, had the rights to the electronic versions of many of Bookcraft's books, as well as Deseret Books' books. And the Deseret Book license said that in the event that Infobases was acquired, that it would lose all the rights to the Deseret Book books. And so we structured the transaction kind of backwards, because Bookcraft was this very large company, Infobases a small company, and we wanted them to be working together. So we essentially had Infobases buy Bookcraft, and then Alan Ashton invested in Infobases in order to make it able to pay the bill, and then we renamed Infobases Bookcraft. So it allowed us to keep all the Deseret books, which was very, very unhappy news for Deseret Book. The first of many other unhappy news items they would receive over the years. So the day the transaction closed, I made an appointment to meet with Ron Millett and Bob Garf at Deseret Book. Ron Millett was the president of Deseret Book, and Bob Garf was the chairman. And I met early in the morning at their offices, and Alan Ashton was with his family on Lake Powell, and so he called in, and he was actually the person to announce the news that we had just acquired Bookcraft. And they were stunned, to say the least, because I think they had always envisioned themselves as buying Bookcraft, and here we were as their new competitor, and so then began the journey of running this 55-year-old LDS publishing company. The day I arrived at the Bookcraft offices and was introduced to the team was also quite startling to the Bookcraft team, because these were many seasoned people in the LDS publishing world. People like Sherry Dew had grown up at Bookcraft, working for them before she went to Deseret Book. But there were old-timers like George Blickenstaff, who had been the editor of many of the Prophets and General Authorities books. He's an Englishman, just a great gentleman. And Corey Maxwell, who was Elder Maxwell's son, was essentially acting as the head of publications. Jan Erickson was our creative director and designer, and the Bookcraft building at the time was in a red kind of industrial building in West Valley City that they had built at a time when Bookcraft also printed their own books. So it was shared with the printing press called Publishers Press, and they had sold Publishers Press earlier as part of a different transaction, but we still shared the same offices. So we were anxious to kind of separate ourselves entirely. So first item of business was to move to a new facility just a few blocks away that was a dedicated Bookcraft building where we had our warehouse intact in the same building as the offices. And it was a nice new facility that we got to christen. And I remember on that very first day, one of the employees came into my office and said, "We've all placed bets on how old you are. Would you mind admitting your age to us?" And so I told him how old I was.
How old were you?
And then I would have been 33, I think, 33. And so they, none of them had guessed correctly. They all thought I was older, much older. So they were surprised. It almost made me the youngest employee of the company to be running it, but it was a wonderful journey. People were so kind to me, helping me learn the business, and Alan would come to the office every Monday, and we would have our editorial board meetings on Mondays where we'd discuss the books and the various projects that we'd undertaken. We at the time were the publisher of The Work and the Glory, which was a series of books by Gerald Lund about the founding of the church and the early church history. And they were a huge hit, the equivalent of Star Wars for Mormons. And when we would publish a new volume, people would line up overnight outside of bookstores to wait to get their copy, and we would sell 100,000 copies, in a weekend. And so we were just on the tail end of the series. I think we had 2 more books in the series when I joined. And we were just in the early stages of evaluating another author who had brought a series concept to us, a man by the name of Ron Carter, who wanted to publish what later became known as Prelude to Glory, which was the story of the Revolutionary War and the founding of America. And Ron became a great friend, and it was a wonderful thing to meet and be involved with him. But probably the highlight of my whole experience at Bookcraft was just the opportunity to meet with the brethren. I had the privilege of sitting in the office of, I believe, all members of the 12 and First Presidency within the first year, and have private visits with them about their ministry and what we could do to support them. For Christmas that first year, we gave to each of the members of 12 and First Presidency a Palm Pilot, which you can think of as the predecessor to smartphones. And we had modified these Palm Pilots by adding an extra memory chip to them so that we could put the entire scripture set of standard works on that Palm Pilot. It was the first time anyone had done that. And so you could actually read the scriptures from the palm of your hand. And we delivered that to each of the brethren. And I remember sitting with President Packer, who had chaired the scripture committee there at the church for many years, who said, as he held this, that he envisioned a day when all members of the church would be able to have the words of the prophets and the scriptures in their hand. And of course, we have definitely seen that and much, much more. Because Alan and I both came from a technology background, and because we also owned Infobases, we were interested in using Bookcraft as sort of a springboard to further our work with digital media. And so we built a team of engineers and marketers and web developers to bring the church to the internet. To that point, the church had not done anything on the internet per se. You even had stake presidents standing up in stake conference and telling their members to stay away from the internet because it was a dark, bad place to be. And indeed, there were dark, bad things going on there. But we had a vision that the internet would one day be a place where much good would be done. Family history work, of course, given our recent experienced ancestry, but also ability for wards and stakes to get together and share calendars and ward lists and missionaries to teach the gospel. Prior to us leaving Ohio, because Lexus was very involved with all things internet,